Hello and welcome to Dawn News English. It's that time of the year when once again we are forced to leave everything aside and talk about heat and heat waves. We know that in Pakistan's largest province of Punjab, schools have been shut this week. About 18 million school children are being advised to stay home, and heat wave is really crippling life across the country. Most affected are Punjab and Sindh province. This heat wave started in April across East Asia. We know large parts of India, Bangladesh, other areas are also suffering from intense temperatures. To talk about and to understand the phenomena of heat and heat waves, we are joined today by Dr. Nausheen Anwar. Dr. Nausheen, thank you so much for joining us. Brief introduction. Dr. Nausheen is an urban planner. She's a professor at IBA Karachi and also the director of Karachi Urban Lab. Now, Dr. Nausheen, you've worked extensively on heat, and from our conversations previously, you focus a lot on chronic heat as opposed to heat waves, which make news headlines, which concern people like us. You look at chronic heat. Can you kind of explain why we ignore chronic heat and why that may be a bigger problem?
First of all, I'm very privileged to be a part of this conversation. Thank you for inviting me. So I'd like to make 2 points in relation to your question. First of all, heat waves are events, and these are generally short-term events. They last for an X number of days or for a few months. But chronic heat has to do with the fact that because of global warming, and also because of global warming's interaction with urban heat islands and various other phenomenon, as is pertinent to the urban context or the context of cities, summer seasons have become longer. And this is something that my colleagues and I at the Karachi Urban Lab have investigated quite thoroughly, using 60 years of meteorological data from the Masroor Air Force Base and the Pakistan Meteorological Department. And we show very clearly that over the last 60 years, the summer season has shifted in cities like Karachi, and it's coming earlier and it's lasting longer. And the chronic heat dimension basically speaks to the fact that you have sustained heat for much longer periods of time. And this sustained heat has to do with different kinds of interactions between human bodies, the general built environment, and the lived experience of extreme heat in relation to feels-like temperatures. Now, this is relevant to heat waves also, but the chronic heat dimension is something that we don't pay attention to at all, and it is equally important, if not even far more pernicious.
So now look, we say and we hear that extreme weather events like heat waves are becoming more frequent and more intense, right? As long as I can remember, when I was a child and I would go to my hometown in Khairpur in Upper Sindh, every summer during summer holidays, heat was unbearable. I mean, what I think is maybe I was a kid and I didn't notice it, and we will still run around. But hasn't it been like always like this?
Yes, that is an excellent question. So in the context of South Asia, India and Pakistan especially, there are specific regions in this geography that have always been spectacularly hot, if one might use that word. So the regions that you have highlighted, as well as places like Jacobabad, have far exceeded our expectations and understandings of what hot temperatures are about. However, given that there is no place on the planet currently that is cooling and everything is getting hotter, the conundrum that we are currently facing is, what do these new thresholds look like? So when you start talking about 51 Celsius ambient temperature, what does that mean when we take into consideration the wet bulb globe temperature, the WBGT, which is a more accurate measure of what extreme heat temperatures look like, because that takes into consideration aspects of humidity. So there are new thresholds that are emerging. These thresholds are pushing the human body's capacity to adapt, to resist, to remain resilient, even in those very super hot regions that have always been hot. So we should be very, very careful when we look at these deep histories of living with heat in South Asia, by keeping in mind what kinds of metrics we use to study heat. That temperature is a metric, but extreme heat is also an embodied experience. It's a lived experience. in relation to things like urban heat islands, the built environment, urban planning failures, concrete, asphalt, mortar, so bricks and mortar, and so forth. So it's important to keep all of these dimensions in mind.
Okay, so I want to talk about governance. I mean, at the end of the day, everything goes back to governance and planning and everything. But I want to pin down, for example, the data. When we say, heat is becoming more intense and frequent, you've clearly looked at the data. Are we saying that maybe, for example, in the last 20 years, Pakistan surfaces as one of the hottest places on Earth? I mean, are we looking at data in that way and trying to quantify it?
There are various ways of looking at this data. There's the quantitative aspect that is very important. There is also the qualitative aspect that is equally important. So when we speak of the quantitative, in this present moment, of course, if we go on Twitter or X or various other websites, we will see there's a considerable amount of knowledge that has been shared on how.
Unfortunately, it's banned in Pakistan, which we can't really go without VPN. But
yeah, in fact, that entire South Asian region is really glowing right now in terms of red signs. It's super hot right now. And so we need these metrics. We need to understand, first of all, how to derive these metrics, what kind of data to use, what I mentioned earlier, it's not just ambient temperature, but it's the WBGT, which is exceedingly important, which is one of the more standard and probably best measures of how to think about extreme heat in metrics. Now, when we move to qualitative data, it's not just about temperatures. When we move to qualitative data generation, we're talking about how the human body's thresholds are shifting. And this is in relation to the kind of work that physiologists are doing right now, very, very important work in the study of heat. What are the various thresholds at which the human body can adapt? So there is a particular standard, it's around 32 Celsius if you're a healthy person. And if you're looking at extreme heat temperatures, so even at 32 Celsius, if these thresholds are being pushed, then even as a healthy person sitting under shade or living in shaded environments, you might be exceedingly vulnerable. Then when you start looking at a plethora of vulnerable populations, from pregnant women to elderly to children, women in general, especially people living in informal settlements and low-income settlements, especially people living in environments where you have acute shortages of energy, electricity, of water, and a third component of infrastructure, which is ventilation, right? If you're looking at high density zones, ground +2, +3, +4, limited ventilation, then you're looking at this not only heat wave, event-related vulnerability, you're looking at chronic heat-related vulnerability that becomes more extended. And then the mental health anxiety aspects. We need far deeper qualitative data on the lived experiences of heat as they relate to these different dimensions of infrastructure, everyday experiences, cooling needs, very, very important. I mean, in Pakistan, we really do not have a clear-cut cooling adaptation plan. For that matter, heat is not taken very seriously at all, in my opinion. It's only seen as a one-time event when it is far more complex. So with the quantitative and the qualitative dimensions give us a better story.
Okay, look, I mean, in layman terms, we know that everything is a class issue and heat is no different. We know that people who are rich, who can afford air conditioners, they will adapt because they have resources. And those who live in low-income areas, who can't afford it, they will suffer the most, and vulnerable populations will suffer the most. Now, I want to get to solutions. I mean, we are not the only country suffering from heat waves. It's happening around the world. Do we have any good examples where cities have tried to tackle this? And I'm not looking at European countries. I want to look at maybe, I don't know, third world countries or low income countries. Have you come across any examples where planners, policy planners on national level, mayors are introducing new initiatives to bring down temperature in a few years' time?
So this is a complex challenge in terms of policy and practice, very complex, because this in turn rests on matters of governance. And so one example, for instance, is that in certain African countries, and I can't remember offhand, at the municipal level, governments have introduced heat officers to handle the everyday dimensions of vulnerability and of people, ordinary citizens living with heat. Heat officers have been put in charge with locally oriented disaster management plans when it comes to heat. And this is where the generation of local knowledge on what heat adaptation is about is exceedingly crucial. This is not top-down technocratic forms of knowledge, which is what we've adapted to in Pakistan, which is the heat wave management plan. has a huge shortcoming in the sense that it says, oh, heat wave is coming, stay indoors. And what it doesn't take into consideration that the indoors can be far more dangerous for certain populations who are without energy, electricity, water, and ventilation. The indoors actually turns into a hot oven. Now, this is something that the World Meteorological Organization and the World Health Organization is looking at very carefully. I'm part of their advisory task force, actually, on the risks of indoor overheating. Now, heat officers have also been assigned to.
Sorry,
go ahead.
I mean, I was looking at today's headline, and it is exactly the same by Met Department, by the government, stay indoors. Now, obviously, if you don't have air conditioner, then what should the advice be? I mean, where should people go?
We need cooling centers. We need spaces on street where there is more shade, different forms of shade. One, example is that we have such a massive sanitation problem, right? That if people get out of the front doors of their homes, how do they walk? How do they negotiate their lanes when there is so much dirt, sitting out there? So women, for instance, who are particularly vulnerable, how can they find cooling environments outside of the confines of their tiny homes in informal settlements and low-income settlements? These are the kinds of basic, really, really simple needs that we need to address. There are examples in the global north and the global south where certain initiatives are happening. But for this, we also need decentralized forms of governance. We need to take very seriously how municipal, local initiatives need to be brought on board to think about resilience, to think about vulnerability and adaptation.
So when I looked at it a little bit, I came across in like not many, but some cities around the world are talking about green infrastructure as like the most common way of handling this, planting more trees, having bigger parks, urban rooftops, vertical greenery and all that stuff. Now, looking at Pakistan, and again, looking at just three big cities, we know that Lahore is far more green than Karachi. Islamabad is arguably probably more green than any other city. Now, can we say that makes a difference? Having those green spaces in some cities is actually making a difference.
Well, the scientific evidence, first of all, suggests that yes, absolutely. The more trees you plant, and depends upon what kinds of trees you plant, that is also very important, that they do bring down the cooling dimension. However, you cited the case for Lahore. In terms of the literature, scientific literature that has come out on Lahore now, it also shows that despite the greenery, this is a city that is hotting up because density, urban sprawl, these kinds of things are also intervening in very drastic ways with the quantity and the quality of that greenery. So this is about urban planning and governance issues, right? Essentially. Now, it's not just enough to build a green park. It's also enough. What matters really is the issue of inequality. Can ordinary citizens access those green parks? What kind of shading elements are provided in those green parks? If those green parks are built with asphalt and cement, with a few little trees planted here and there, then that's really not a greening initiative. It becomes a kind of a gentrification initiative that shows up on policies and plans as, we spent the money here that was funded by the World Bank, and here we have a little project. That's really not a viable greening initiative. A viable greening initiative is that ordinary citizens have access to parks. There is proper shading. Shading has to be seen as a right. Every ordinary citizen across cities like Karachi and Lahore has a right to shade. What do we mean today in the context of global warming when we talk about two things, the right to cooling and the right to shade? Both are intermittent. And here we can talk about informal workers, construction workers working outdoors, their thresholds of heat. Where do they find shade, especially in a city like Karachi, where urban renewal strategies are increasingly displacing people from access to shade, right? So once again, this dovetails with issues of governance, public policy, municipal arrangements, and so forth.
Okay, so my last question, because you are an expert working on heat, but you're also in advisory capacity, you are on various government boards and so on and so forth. When you talk to government policymakers, is there appetite for a paradigm shift in terms of planning, or is it business as usual, just building roads and concrete, not really thinking about consequences long term?
I think it's a little bit of both. And I would say that there are very few people at the bureaucratic level who are thinking out of the box and truly understand the situation. There are many more people, bureaucrats and politicians, for whom it's business as usual. And so how do we shift that meter, right? That dial? This is the incredibly important question right now. So even if we look at our national adaptation plan that came out recently, heat is talked about in terms of a metric. It's not talked about in far more substantive terms as an embodied experience that rests on issues of intersectionality, on inequality, on issues of thermal justice. The word thermal inequality and thermal injustice has to be brought into conversations on how we think about extreme heat and its impacts across urban centers increasingly in Pakistan, its relationship with mental health, with food, with migration, with undernutrition, many different dimensions. There is very little talk or understanding of any of these issues in Pakistan.
It's a tall order. I think we begin by first educating ourselves and others and policymakers that we can still do something about it. I mean, we are great at creating problems, but we also can find solutions as well. Thank you so much for joining us today and clarifying this. We will hopefully speak to you again soon. Thank you so much.